In the last video, I talked about my 5 favorite minis in Warcraft Rumble, but in Rumble, you also need 5 different leaders, because if you want to progress through the hard missions, you have to do it with 5 different leaders. So I thought, natural follow-up to the previous video, let's talk about my 5 favorite leaders. Shout out to Warcraft Rumble for sponsoring this video, and let's get going. Number 1 for me is going to be Sylvanas Windrunner. Has a really cool pairing in the previous video where I talked about my 5 favorite minis, and one of them was Banshee. Well, the cool thing about Sylvanas is when she dies, she actually summons a Banshee that can then take over another enemy unit. She's a 6-drop, so kind of expensive, but you get pretty good value because you get basically a free 4-drop in Banshee with her. Now, one of her abilities makes her, in my opinion, a lot better, which is Black Arrow, pierce through enemies in a line, dealing elemental damage. If you get this ability, it makes it where her basic attacks are basically a small, thin AoE line, which you can use to nuke through weaker minions. So she gives a lot of value, in my own personal opinion. Scream on Death, stunning nearby enemies for 3 seconds help. So that way, when she becomes a Banshee, and Banshee's very squishy, the Banshee doesn't get killed fairly quickly, so useful for that one. And then nearby Horde and Undead minions gain Fury, just a little bit of extra DPS for your units. But for me, I think both the top 2 here are quite important in terms of abilities. She is a little bit squishy. So if you look at her health here, she's 19 for me, but only 2,400 health approximately. She does hit. She has pretty good damage, but she is fairly squishy. And then her leadership ability is not bad. Horde and Undead allies move 30% faster. I don't think it's necessarily the best ability in the world, but herself is a pretty good unit. Obviously, she can hit air units as well as ground units. She has a bow after all, so for that reason, she can be used to counter air units too. So I think she gives a lot of value just as a card herself. Maybe her leader ability isn't super amazing, but I think that she gives a lot of value for a 6-drop. So Sylvanas Windrunner is going to make my top 5, and is the character that I use for Undead. Number 2 for me is going to be Rin Blackhand. Kind of a cool unit, kind of similar to Sylvanas, where you get sort of 2 units in one. He's basically a Drake unit, the 4-drop, and then when the Drake dies, he gets on foot and continues the battle. Now, there is an ability that makes it a little bit better called Legionnaire, which when he first receives damage, he dismounts, but then the Drake keeps going, so you kind of get both of them at the same time. Does make it a little bit weaker, the AoE, but also increases the DPS, obviously. So not too bad. Living Bomb upon dismounting, damaging nearby enemies is pretty nice for AoE. And then Scale and Steel gain resistance while flying and armored while dismounted. It just makes him tankier. Now, if you look at the leader ability, the other flying troops cost 1 less. Is really good because you can pair it with units like Drake, for instance, and they're going to only cost 3. So if you have a very airborne heavy deck, Rin Blackhand, it can actually be pretty terrifying. You can spam them down very quickly. In terms of tankiness, he's actually decently tanky. It's not like some of the other leaders on this list were kind of squishy, like Sylvanas comes to mind, but you can see the stats there at level 19. You know, Rind alone is 6,600 HP, so decently tanky. Not amazing damage when dismounted, but it kind of flip-flops the rows from like DPS to tank when you dismount. So I tend to find myself pairing him with a lot of air units, for instance. I should probably drop Living Bomb out of this deck, actually. We need some lower cost minions, but I do find myself using him, obviously, with airborne spam. Number 3 for me is Old Murkai. So far, I've only invested in a handful of leaders, but because of the way that the missions work, I have to have 5 different leaders, so I started putting some resources into Old Murkai. Reason is, I don't actually know if he's that good. I just think he's hilarious. So the way he actually works is after you spawn him, what his ability does is for 5 seconds, every time you deploy minions, you're getting Murloc Tidehunter. So you're spamming out Murlocs, basically, for each gold that you spend on your other minions. So if you actually look at the video here and the way it works, when he actually spawns in like the Golem, he gets a huge burst of other Murlocs. So he is effectively a zoo build. He's a spam zoo build, which I think is pretty hilarious. Gets countered pretty hard by AoE, but a fun build nonetheless. Now, the different abilities allow those Murlocs to spawn with him. One allows him to have a longer period in terms of being able to actually spawn them, because you only get 5 seconds, but it doubles it to 10. And then the third one just makes it where he briefly stuns additional enemies. So he's going to be the next leader that I'm actually starting to build out, because I've only had the ability to build out 3 of these so far, which leads us into number 4, which is the third guy I built out, the one I built out the most, which is Tyrion. I think Tyrion is absolutely busted. He seems awesome. Basically, how he works is he is sort of like he's just a melee unit, okay? Not really like extremely tanky, but not squishy. has decent damage, but that's not his point. The point of him actually is that he can heal, and his abilities are awesome. So if you look at his abilities here, he's got 3 of them just like everybody else. By the Light makes it where he basically double heals whoever his main unit actually is, because he heals somebody and he heals other people around him. And then Divine Shield, gain a magical shield, 30% health, absorbing all damage for 5 seconds. 5 seconds in this day and age in this game is actually pretty nuts, because you're going to be absorbing a ton of damage as a tank. 5 seconds can be like a full Abomination health pool, for instance. So this is a pretty nuts card. Consecration, regularly consecrate the ground, damaging enemies within. I feel like that's kind of whatever. I picked the other ones first. In my opinion, I think Divine Shield is nuts, and I think By the Light is nuts. I pair this with Abomination or like a tank. So I put Abomination forward, and then I'm just constantly healing, and Abomination being the primary target is getting healed twice as much. If you look at this leadership ability, heals all nearby friendly units. That's one I was talking about, which is now you understand why the healing twice as much makes sense. And then if you look at his stats here, 5k HP. Pretty good. Qualifies as a tank, armored unit. He still actually does decent damage. He's not like ultra tanky. For instance, like Abomination is tankier than him. You know, like the Rend I showed you is tankier than him. But he's not too squishy either. So Tyrion, for me, seems like a nuts character. I really, really like Tyrion. Extremely useful in a variety of scenarios. Can heal like weaker units in AoE. Can heal a primary tank double as much with the ability I was talking about. Actually does good damage himself. You can use him defensively to tank because he can heal himself. So if he's sitting there and you drop him from a turret to like tank for a little bit, he'll be healing himself too. If you delay long enough in a lane, you can actually drop 2 of them and they'll heal each other. So there's some combos you can do with him. He's maybe my favorite card in the entire game. I call them card, they're minis, but he's maybe my favorite character, my favorite mini in the entire game, hands down. He's also my highest level card because I've invested the most in him. So personally, Tyrion for me, yeah, he's going to be my favorite leader, which brings us to number 5. Last but not least is the Jimro. I think he works in a very niche down deck, but I'm going to explain him. So basically how he works is nearby enemies take 50% more elemental damage. There's an ability, however, that makes it where when he dies, he drops a banner that lasts for 10 seconds, which has the same effect. So you get this 50% additional elemental damage for a while in that area. Now, you're going to pair him with things that do elemental damage. So, for instance, Fire Elemental. Obviously, this is elemental damage. Drake, he has Fire Breath. That's an AoE of elemental damage. Living Bomb, for instance. That is elemental damage. So you're going to build a deck around this combination in order to have significant DPS, and it's sort of a high damage type of deck with these minis. Now, there is one other ability I like, which makes it where he attacks Pierce through in a line. This is what I liked when I mentioned previous about Sylvanas Windrunner, that allows you to basically nuke down lower HP targets. I use the example of chickens because it's the obvious one. His other passive trait just gives additional resistance stats to nearby allies. So he's mostly about rush down, tons of DPS. And you're going to pair him with elementos. So if you happen to be building a deck that has strong elementos, then you might want to consider using him as a leader. But if you're using, for instance, lots of air units, even though Drake is both elemental and air, which is something nice about this, you can pair him with both of them, then instead you want to use Rend Blackhand. So depending upon, for this faction, depending upon what minis you have are the best, that is the deck you're going to build around, either Elemento or you're going to build the air unit deck with Rend Blackhand. I myself prefer air, even though my Elementos are probably a little bit better. Another good thing about him is he's pretty ultra tanky. If you look at it, 9,800 health. Granted, he's level 20, but that is a significant amount of health. That's, I think, the tankiest card I have out of literally any mini right now. And he's a 5-drop, so he's not ultra expensive. You get the tank of an Abomination without having to really pay all 6 of that as well. You can pair him with your Elemental cards as well, which means you can drop him and a Drake at the same time, for instance, to get a tank in front and also good elemental damage behind. Compare him with a Flame Waker, which is another ranged elemental style of damage, or even spells like Chain Lightning, for instance. Because of the way that the hard missions work, I realized I needed to invest in more leaders earlier, so don't make the mistake I did and get all the way to the hard missions, and now you're like, okay, well, I need 3 other additional leaders I wish I had worked on, as my goal is still to get to 90 sigils so I can do raids and sieges. I think they look fun, but it's going to take a while to get there. So probably the next thing I'm going to do is work on Old Murkai. He will take care of the beast for me. Rend Blackhand is probably going to be my primary here. And then I'm also going to be using Sylvanas Windrunner, Tyrion, And then I need to get one more here for Horde. So between Horde, I'm not really sure about the Horde units. I've basically completely ignored the Horde leaders at the moment. So I'll have to look into these guys a little bit more and figure out which of these I'm actually going to end up using. Because right now they're just getting carried by the cards for me. But for the leaders that I've tried, those are the favorite ones I've used so far. So those are my top 5 favorite leaders that I've currently used in Warcraft Rumble. I'm having to learn more about the leaders every day because I need to push through the hard missions in the campaign. And it looks like Horde, if you look here, Horde's going to be the next one that I'm going to have to dig into. So that's about it for this video. Shout out to Warcraft Rumble for sponsoring this one, and I'll see you on the next episode.